Hello, Yakri here with another Warframe video. This time I want to talk about everything wrong with Eidolons in Warframe. I've seen a lot of criticism of the Eidolon fights by many people in the Warframe community at large and by various YouTubers. However, I personally feel like much of it misses the mark. In particular, I don't believe that the problem with Eidolons has much to do with how much HP they have, or the fact that they have phases, or even that they are immune to being affected by Warframe abilities. Instead, I think the issues that these boss fights have are all about their dependence on grind in order for you to perform well in them, to the exclusion of functional mechanics being the deciding factor. The Eidolons are not so hard to take down if you have a few arcanes for your frame and operator, some focus school waybounds unlocked, a non-mode amp built, and a meta warframe and weapon. In particular, not having the armor and HP enhancing waybounds and corresponding arcanes for your operator makes these fights extremely painful. While you certainly can complete a Eidolon run without these arcanes or any waybounds unlocked, it can be extremely frustrating to do so, largely because of a plethora of effectively unavoidable damage coming out from the Eidolons. I say effectively unavoidable because it seems clear to me that the developers intended for much of this damage to be avoided, but in practical terms the player frequently has no opportunity to avoid it, or even sufficient incentive to do so in many cases. The Eidolon fights suffer horribly from the awkward camera angle caused by their extreme height and the third-person perspective that the game is played in. Your camera is usually angled upward, preventing you from seeing the ground in front of you. You also need to stay close in to the Eidolon to hit it with the better amps and to deal with the Vomvelists. This, paired with the effect pollution in the later two fights, creates a number of issues. Firstly, each Eidolon fight has one or more ground hazards that you can only see and avoid by looking at the ground in front of you. The Gauntletist and Hydralist in particular have mechanics that require immediate action to avoid, which you will miss if you don't look down. Secondly, each Eidolon fight has one or more aerial hazards, some of which are small and hard to see despite dealing high damage, and are easily missed if you don't have some distance between yourself and the Eidolon, since they frequently come from directly overhead, making your field of view too narrow to always see them, even when looking up at the Eidolon. And thirdly, each fight has random or homing abilities which are not sufficiently telegraphed. The net result here is that there is a ton of damage coming out during the Eidolon fights that you need to tank rather than dodge because you can't reasonably expect to see it coming and avoid it. In many ways, the Eidolon fights are set up like traditional MMORPG boss fights, with mechanics such as don't stand in the fire and heal checks. However, in a traditional MMO, the camera angle and distance involved work far better for these mechanics, and most attacks have more clearly predictable or delineated paths, allowing the player to often avoid them, even during their first attempt at a fight. Take the Eidolon attack that causes the ground to explode in a line. This is a wide area homing attack which will circle back on you after passing through you initially. The way around this is to go invulnerable and sit like that until it comes back through you and it's safe to pop out of invulnerability mode and keep dealing damage. Now what's lacking here is twofold. There isn't a good warning for this attack. It's only telegraphed by an animation which is very similar to some other animations that indicate different attacks, and it will mean nothing to you your first couple of times in the fight. There also isn't a good solution besides the blanket Tenno form invulnerability, meaning that often the best move is that if you see an animation that looks like an attack, just go invulnerable till it's over. There's no need to avoid it in any special way, and if you don't, you can expect to be punished harshly. Now, suppose instead of these homing quakes, we had them preempted by an effect along their intended path that would lock them in that path, giving the player an indication that something bad is coming their way, and giving the player an opportunity to sidestep the attack, rather than just waiting it out in invulnerability mode on the assumption that something bad is going to happen. It also gives you, more room for the player to perform better than just sitting it out in vulnerability mode and do a variety of actions, right? Instead of like, all right, some attack is coming, let's go invulnerable. How about give the player the knowledge that a particular attack is coming, which they might be able to avoid by stepping to the side, staying out of invulnerability mode, aka void form, and in doing so, allowing them to continue dealing damage better, right? Which is good for you as the player. You'll be able to beat the fight faster. Now, this as well as giving you, this also gives you the possibility to utilize invulnerability mode without pre-existing knowledge of the fight, even as is, right? Because when you're first doing this fight, it surprises a lot of people that you're going to get homed in on by this ground exploding attack. It's really not going to expect it to be coming. But if there's some sort of indicator, like a lot of MMOs will have, like if there's going to be a line attack or something, there will be a indicator that an attack is about to happen, that the ground is going to explode. Like maybe the ground cracks under you and light comes up through it, right? and then after half a second, it explodes. This gives you a pretty obvious indicator if you've played video games before that something bad is coming your way, right? And you should get out of the way. But there isn't really anything like that in Warframe. Just the actual attack comes right at you, and if you haven't done the fight before, you're probably going to get hit by it a few times until you get used to the fact that, you know, when the Eidolon does some sort of, maybe it's attacking animation, you just go invulnerable. Next, let's talk about this Warframe's version of Don't Stand in the Fire mechanic, right? There's these patches of sentient blood on the ground during each fight after you destroy one of the Synovas, and these are all of the classic Don't Stand in the Fire type of mechanics seen in many MMOs. Where, you know, you take damage over time the longer you stand in them, and it's usually fairly high, encouraging you to get the heck out of them. However, there are several problems with this kind of mechanic in Warframe and in the Eidolon fights in particular. Now, first off, Warframe uses random composition pickup groups. Primarily, this means that you may very well have no means of healing through hit chip damage from briefly standing in these fire patches for the majority of players. And second, in Eidolon fights, you are frequently unable to see the ground, as I've mentioned before, because of the camera angles involved. Now, the net result of this is that even if you quickly step back from these patches of fire, they can represent a serious problem in some but not all runs. Worse, you can't reasonably be expected to keep track of all such fire patches, since they are relatively innocuous looking and hard to see, and you'll be angling your camera in such a way as to miss them. Now, as such, you'll tend to be heavily penalized if you can't heal through the minor damage from these. However, you are not assured any means of doing this. You know, unless you actually go into the group chat and find a group manually, or you have some friends to play with, which is really not the case for a lot of players. I certainly don't play that way all the time. Even worse, in your Tenno form, you need to unlock more waybounds to handle the fire puddles properly, as you can't actually heal up in Space Kid form with Warframe powers, right? You need the actual like Space Kid regeneration ability from waybounds. And without that, your only alternative is to just die repeatedly in Space Kid form, which is like a whole different issue. Now, this leads nicely into the mechanic in the Hydralisk fight, which is essentially an insanely high damage, massive area of effect version of this ground effect, and it's still all too easy to miss since it's only shown by a green tint on the ground, which you aren't looking at. Actually, I'd completed a number of Eidolon runs before I noticed that this mechanic existed myself. Now, I don't want to belabor the point in too much detail, but there is a consistent problem with fight mechanics requiring grind in order to counter, requiring prior knowledge of the fight in order to counter, or requiring a simple heal tank check, which, again, you can't necessarily depend on since it is kind of a group effort, and you aren't guaranteed that sort of, you know, a capability, right, in these fights, which, again, we should point out this is different from... This is different from regular missions because the level of healing required isn't really available to you in Eidolon fights, but it is in normal missions. Things like Life Strike make it much more viable to heal yourself up if you really need a lot of healing in normal Warframe missions, because there's a lot of, you know, random enemies laying around, and you don't have that in the Eidolon fights. And additionally, unless you do have like really maxed out equipment, you're not going to have the option to just take the Eidolons on alone. So most players are going to need to actually work in a squad, and you also may not have access to the right Warframes to actually be able to guarantee that you have that kind of heal on your team from like Trinity or something in order to make these fights like reasonably viable without like a ton of high grind stuff that you need access to, like arcanes and waybounds, right? So mechanics here need large improvements to their visibility and need to be better telegraphed. Additionally, it is my opinion that wide area like AoE heal and heal check type abilities need to be toned down. With the Warframe style of grouping, it needs to be more viable to fight the Eidolons without a healing/support frame specifically required. In particular, it'd be nice to see something done about the fact that Trinity is almost mandatory in order to ensure that the freaking lures are kept alive, because they die far too easily in the later on fights. So this could be achieved by making mechanics easier to dodge, as well as more viable to dodge in both Warframe and Tenno form, meaning less homing stuff, or worse tracking on homing abilities, meaning it's more realistic that if you really like bullet jumped sideways, you're definitely going to avoid it relatively easily, or maybe they move a little bit slower, giving you more time to react. Maybe the high priority abilities are brighter, or you could also do other things like make just like these little homing bullets that are like a ton of little pellets that track after you. Those would be a lot nicer if they were, say, one bigger, slower pellet that was a bit brighter, right? So you could actually spot it in the first place. So I think I've established that I want to see the mechanics in the Eidolon fights more clearly communicated to players. That's like the biggest thing. There's too much crap going on in the fights. The camera angle makes it really hard to see abilities. So I think like the fights need to be like refocused around abilities you can actually see coming, and abilities that exist currently need to be changed so that you can see them coming. And like the things that can't be like fit into that mold maybe shouldn't be in the fights at all. Right? That's my opinion. Obviously, you don't have to take it as law or anything, but that's how I see it. Okay, so let's move on to another big issue. So I believe that the biggest single problem with this is how difficult it is to play around the mechanics instead of through the mechanics. And that needs to change in order for playing around them to be more viable and better rewarded. And one big part of this is that void mode that you have access to in Space Kid form, right? And I know I'll get some flack for suggesting this, but that ability is far too powerful. It counters everything in the Eidolon fights except for the stomp attack knockback. It massively sucks the variety out of dealing with the Eidolon mechanics when in Kid form. You end up doing one of two things: taking damage to keep shooting, or tapping the invuln button before you get hit by some kind of nuke. If the ability is not reduced in duration, there need to be attacks from the Eidolon that pierce void form, preferably multiple such attacks, actually, right? So there's some abilities that you need to avoid, and some abilities that you can, like, avoid by avoid, I mean, like, actually moving out of the way, dodging, maybe, like, an ability that's, like, some sort of thing that you can shoot to, like, destroy before it hits you, or reflect with your melee attack, who knows? And then some other abilities that you can actually just sort of tank through by going invulnerable, right? So instead we just need that variety of mechanics, right? Instead of standing still in the correct position and waiting for your opportunity to shoot again. And allowing void form to solve all the problems in these fights is really just a cop-out to the previously mentioned issues with the fight mechanics, and it sucks a lot of fun and variety out of the fights, right? I think it's a crutch for these fight mechanics. And it, if like, fights are changed in the way I would like to see them changed, so that they are so that your own like player skill is more involved and grinding is a little bit less required to be good at these fights, then I think that void mode will become even more overpowered than it is already, right? And so it really needs to be nerfed as part of this. Now, obviously, if it were nerfed, you know, prior to a lot of these changes to the things that I'm complaining about, then these fights would be really intolerable to actually like suffer through. But in order to make them good, it needs to be reduced in power, in my opinion. Now, I think the last like big issue with the Eidolon fights are the lures, right? Now, I've already mentioned these indirectly or briefly throughout the other topics I've been talking about, right? But the lures are a cancerous fucking mess, to be honest. These pesky little shits require you to bring a healer of some kind if you want to ensure victory. Even if your squad could potentially tank or avoid all damage against the Eidolons, you still need a healer to keep the fucking lures alive, because they sure as shit won't. And the reason for this is that the Gauntletist in particular, as well as the Hydralist, have some massive damage, wide area attacks, which the lures will not intentionally avoid, and the lures, of course, can be killed. Relatively easily, in fact, in the later two fights. As a bonus, these lures must be kept close to the Eidolons after destroying a Sinova, and that means that both you and the lures must be healed or protected from damage and magnetic procs, since you have to sit there with the lures next to the Eidolon to make sure that they don't leave and the Eidolon doesn't teleport across the map, slowing down your run. Now, consequently, this is a pretty unfriendly requirement to the pickup group style of Warframe, where you might not have both a good way to protect people from magnetic procs or to heal the lures from unrelenting AoE damage over the course of the 3 fights in a Tridolon hunt. It makes it pretty dependent on the player to counter this mechanic by bringing a sufficiently optimized Warframe and not by some actual reaction to the mechanics, right? Like the AoEs and stuff. You need to bring the right Warframe, like Trinity, probably, just like Trinity, and then like another Warframe to deal with the magnetic procs, or either that or grind out a lot of arcanes and stuff. And that's it. That's what you got to do, right? You can't play around it. And this kind of thing would be sort of fine if we were playing World of Warcraft, right? And I could queue up for a group and get a group with a tank, a healer, and 3 DPS. But in Warframe, you sign up for the fight, you walk in, right? And if this is assuming you're one of the majority of people who don't actually go to like looking for group chat, and you go in and you get a random collection of people, right? You might get 4 rhinos, right? And I think that there's nothing wrong with that, and encounters in the game should not be designed so that 4 rhinos could not beat the encounter realistically as long as they play well. And lures are almost this like RNG mechanic where I have totally won Tridolon hunts with no healer frame and lures around. And I've also had those runs destroyed by the lures just standing in AoEs and dying, and there's not really much you can do about it. So it's a very frustrating, very like out of place mechanic, I feel, compared to the overall style of the game. Okay? So, all right, now let's recap the issues we have here. 1. The Warframe camera style is heavily at odds with the fights and their mechanics, making many otherwise reasonable mechanics excessively hard or unrealistic to avoid. 2. The conveyance just isn't there for many of the mechanics, making the fights needlessly confusing without a third-party guide. 3. Some of the mechanics are poorly executed and don't fit well with the way people usually do these fights, such as the nigh impossible to spot ground fire, the homing energy missiles that come out of nowhere to triple in damage, etc. 4. Space Kid mode is almost a joke, without many waybounds and arcanes because it dies so easily, and from so many hard to see or predict sources. Additionally, and somewhat paradoxically, the penalties for dying in operator mode are actually too small, borderline non-existent. 5. Void mode is a one-size-fits-all solution which sucks the depth out of the fight mechanics. 6. Practically everything is wrong with how the lures work. They require a healer to reliably stay alive, but not every healer, of which there aren't many anyway, works well. They also require you to behave in counterintuitive ways in response to the mechanics to stay close to the Eidolons, and they're constantly in the way. Right? I didn't actually touch on that too much, but I have a whole nother video about how much it fucking pisses me off how the lure AI works, right? Which is poorly. And that's everything wrong with the Eidolon fights. If you like this video and want to see more content like it, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you all for watching. Yakri out.